Hello friends, welcome back to Zhenguandian. I'm Zhen Fei. In the past few days, a place name has suddenly gone viral on the Chinese internet. The three characters, Zang Muto, have sparked hundreds of thousands of rumours. A video about recruiting people for a mass grave has shot up to several million views. But what's truly odd is the comments section. If you click in, you'll notice a very unified, repressed collective mood, tinged with old wounds. Some people say, "My first love went to Guangdong in '94 and never returned." She was never heard from again. Her mother died of grief within 3 years. Others say that in 2004, bodies were often found in the fields around Dongguan. It is also said that every village had people go missing among the millions of workers in Guangdong. Some even say that present-day northern Myanmar is just like Zang Muto was back then. These words are truly chilling. So what kind of place was Zang Muto really? Why did it become a collective nightmare for so many people? What exactly happened in those years? In today's episode, we'll take 25 minutes to clearly explain this deliberately erased chapter of history to you, all in one go. If you enjoy this kind of series where we cover major events in just 25 minutes, be sure to subscribe to Zhenguandian. Here at Zhenguandian, we often guide you through the hottest topics all in one go, and we also share stories about notable figures, as well as delve into the secrets behind the news. So if you enjoy this kind of content, why not give me a like right now? And to our new friends, you're very welcome to subscribe to us. Let's take a step back in time to the early 1990s, when the wave of China's reform and opening up swept across the Pearl River Delta. Dongguan, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, factories were being built everywhere. Recruiting workers. In those days, young people from rural areas all over China shared the same dream, to head south to Guangdong. They carried woven plastic bags, clutching a few hundred yuan for travel expenses that their families had scraped together, squeezed onto the old green trains and spent 3 days and nights on the journey. From Sichuan, Guizhou, Yangtze, Hubei, they travelled all the way south to Guangzhou. As soon as they got off the train, they were greeted by the humid air, unfamiliar Cantonese, and streets plastered with colourful job adverts. A new life was about to begin, but what they didn't know was that the moment they set foot in Guangzhou, danger was also lurking. Perhaps it was brewing right at the exit of the railway station, or maybe just around the next street corner. Someone might block their way and immediately ask a question that would decide their fate. At this, many people would panic on the spot, because in Guangdong in those days, whether you could stay and work didn't depend on your ability to do the job, but on a single piece of paper. This piece of paper was called a temporary residence permit. With it, you were legal. Without it, you were an undocumented person, one of the so-called 3-no individuals. If the joint security team saw you, they could take you away. But was it easy to get this permit? 150 to 300 yuan was hardly cheap. Back then, an ordinary worker's monthly wage was only 500 or 600, which meant that before they'd even found their feet, they had to fork out half a month's wages for a piece of paper that was only valid for a year. And it wasn't as if you could just get this paper whenever you fancied. Many small factories simply wouldn't help you apply for it. Young people from the countryside who just arrived in the city might not even know they needed it, let alone where to get it. But the problem was that the streets were crawling with joint defence teams in camouflage uniforms, and security patrols roamed in groups, checking during the day, at night, and even carrying out surprise raids on rented rooms in the middle of the night. What was even more absurd was that even having the right documents didn't necessarily guarantee your safety. Some people had their ID cards on them but had left their temporary residence permits in their dormitories. No matter how they tried to explain, it was useless. They were taken away on the spot. There were even cases where the security patrols tore up people's temporary residence permits right in front of them. Then they'd ask, "Do you have your documents now? Come with me." How could things end up like this? Because there were quotas for arrests, something we'll discuss later on, so do make sure you watch until the end of today's programme. The further we go, the darker the secrets become. To avoid these inspections, back then, migrant workers tried just about every trick in the book. Some climbed over factory walls, others crawled into the sewers, and some hid in the cold storage rooms of vegetable markets. Shivering from the cold, they still didn't dare come out, because they knew that once caught, they'd be sent somewhere else, a place where, once you went in, many never came out again. Nowadays, Zhangmuto is just an ordinary small town in Dongguan, Guangdong, but from 1992 to 2003, it was the largest detention and repatriation transit centre in the entire Pearl River Delta. Over those 11 years, according to available records, more than 830,000 people were detained there. What do 830,000 people look like? That's equivalent to the population of a medium-sized city. So what did those who were caught and sent to Zang Muto face? A woman named Chen Wei, who was once detained in Zang Muto, later told Radio Free Asia that when she walked into the cell in Zang Muto, which was like a cave, she saw a group of people inside who looked like skeletons. With vacant stares, they gathered around her. She said that scene reminded her of the images when the Soviet army opened the gates of Auschwitz concentration camp during the Second World War. Once inside, the first thing that awaited them was a beating. Some who experienced it recalled that as soon as you went in, you'd get a beating. This was called showing who's boss. Then, if you were even slightly disobedient inside, you'd be beaten until you complied. Some had their ribs broken, some were beaten so badly they couldn't walk, and some were even beaten to death. After that came forced labour. After that, there was extortion. Once someone was taken inside, how could they get out? There were only two ways. The first was to get your family or friends to pay for your release. How much would it cost? It could be 200, 300 or 600 yuan, depending on which level you were being held at. A survivor recalled that in the middle of the night, the guards would make them call someone from their hometown to bring money. Only after paying 600 yen would they be released. If no one came to pay the ransom, then there was the second way. Alternatively, you could wait to be sent home, but deportation wasn't much better. The process had a major flaw. They didn't properly verify identities during repatriation, so mistaken identities or missing people were common. Some people would even be dumped halfway, left in the middle of nowhere. Even more frightening was human trafficking. Many reports indicate that the Zang Muto detention centre was involved in selling detainees to other regional detention centres for a fee per person. Here, attentive viewers will surely have sensed that this so-called quota is actually about the number of people detained. Otherwise, why would they be sold to other detention centres on a per-head basis? We'll talk about the dark secrets behind this in a moment. Someone who experienced it said that he was sold from Zang Muto to a detention centre in Hunan for 50 yuan. Things were even worse there. He often saw more than a dozen headless female corpses in the nearby ditches. For women, this was the detention centre's darkest corner. Migrant workers said the prettiest girls in Zang Muto were the most likely to vanish. They were trafficked into sex work, sold to remote areas, or even abused to death. People who had been locked up in there later said that the staff would specifically pick out the pretty girls to abuse first, and then let the cell bosses take turns abusing them. This sort of thing wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the norm. Speaking of this, I really want to ask everyone, do you have any family members or friends, or have you yourself ever experienced or heard about China's detention centres? If so, please do leave us a comment below and share what you've heard or personally witnessed with more people. If, like me, this is your first time hearing about the Zang Muto detention centre, then please let me know that this is your first time learning about it as well. So as you can see, once you enter the whole scene, first there's a beating, and those who are bailed out are considered the lucky ones. Back then, communication was far less convenient. Those not bailed out were moved elsewhere. Without ID checks, people were often misdirected, overlooked or resold, causing many to go missing. During the 11 years that the Zang Muto detention centre was in operation, the authorities never released any figures on how many people died or went missing. There were no statistics on missing persons, nor any records of unnatural deaths. The management of records was an utter shambles, with people registered under false names. Records were trashed and no CCTV existed. If someone vanished, they'd just claim deportation with no further explanation. Recently, a blogger estimated the scale using scattered records, a conservative guess mind you. Over the course of 11 years, at least 800 to 4,000 people died in Zang Muto due to abuse, starvation, disease and beatings. As many as 2,500 to 8,000 people may have permanently disappeared because of reasons such as escape, trafficking or illegal entry. In other words, over the span of 11 years, nearly 10,000 people vanished from this place called Zang Muto. But what's truly frightening is that Zang Muto was merely a microcosm of the national detention centre system. In those days, from Shenzhen to Guangzhou, from Guangzhou to Hunan, such detention centres existed everywhere, and similar incidents were happening all over the place. It wasn't until the death of one man, Sun Zhigang, born in 1976 in Huanggang, Hubei, who studied design and had only graduated 2 years prior, having worked in Shenzhen, that things began to change. In February 2003, he came to Guangzhou to work as a graphic designer at a clothing company. He had been in Guangzhou for less than a month and hadn't yet had time to apply for a temporary residence permit. On the night of 17th March 2003, an ordinary evening, he went out to use the internet. Thinking it was just nearby, he didn't take his ID card with him. At around 11 o'clock that night, while walking along Huangcheng Street, he was stopped by people checking temporary residence permits. Because he didn't have a temporary residence permit, he was taken to the Huangcheng Street police station in Tianhe district. After arriving at the station, Sun Zhigang called his flatmate, Mr. Chen, asking him to bring his ID card and some money over. He tried to bail him out, but Mr. Chen was unable to secure Sun Zhigang's release. According to later investigations, it may have been because Sun Zhigang had an altercation with the police while in custody, so they refused to let him go no matter what. Sun Zhigang was thus detained at the police station. That same night, he was transferred to the Guangzhou City Custody and Repatriation Transit Centre. On the very same day, he was then sent from the custody centre to a relief station. On the 20th, the authorities at the release station announced that Sun Zhigang had died. There were only 72 hours between his arrest and his death. How did Sun Zhigang die? The hospital claimed it was a sudden heart attack, but later forensic examination revealed that Sun Zhigang had subcutaneous hemorrhaging as thick as 3 to 5 centimetres, and the affected area was as large as 60 by 50 centimetres. Just imagine that area, 60 by 50 centimetres. Sun Zhigang, when he was alive, was a young man who stood at 1,74 m with broad shoulders and a wide back. Such a large area of bleeding meant that almost his entire back was a hemorrhagic zone. The autopsy results showed that the cause of his death was traumatic shock due to extensive soft tissue damage on his back, with the soft tissue injury leading to cellular necrosis and bleeding. Because the bleeding occurred internally, it was not visible to the naked eye, and in severe cases it can result in widespread intravascular hemolysis. Once this happens, the patient usually dies rapidly, making emergency treatment extremely difficult. In other words, Sun Zhigang was beaten to death. And it all happened within just 3 days. Friends, pay attention to that timeline just mentioned. On the very first day, Sun Zhigang was sent from the detention centre to the medical aid station. During the 2 days he spent at the aid station, he remained in a coma, which indicates that he was already in traumatic shock by that point. In other words, on the very first day, on the day he was locked up, he had already been beaten so badly that he suffered extensive bleeding across his entire back. Just how terrifying was it inside there, Li Keqiang? Sun Zhigang's death caused a huge stir. What happened next changed the course of history. On 25th of April 2003, Southern Metropolis Daily published a report on the death of detainee Sun Zhigang. 2 journalists gave a detailed account of the entire process, Sun Zhigang being detained, transferred and beaten to death. As well as the ordeal his family faced, unable to seek justice through any official channels, Chen Yizong, who was then the editor-in-chief of Southern Metropolis Daily, later recalled that at the time he had only one thought. He absolutely had to get this report published before the propaganda department issued a ban, to break the silence in one fell swoop. He knew this posed a huge risk to his own career, but he still took the gamble and approved the publication of the report. The morning after the report was published, there were already thousands of comments on Sina.com, and the newspaper's hotline was almost overwhelmed with calls. One business owner even rang in personally, saying that he himself had been detained 6 times. Major media outlets across the country quickly reprinted the story, and Sun Zhigang's name spread throughout China overnight. Suddenly, people realised that they themselves could easily become the next Sun Zhigang at any moment. Afterwards, media outlets from all over the country began to report extensively on the darkness of the detention system, and one similar case after another was exposed. Zhang Mingjun, a man from Sichuan who was once detained in Guangzhou, had his ID card, proof of inheritance and work permit, but simply because he didn't have a temporary residence permit for Guangzhou, he was arrested by the police while sitting on the steps eating bread at night and sent to a detention centre where he was beaten that very night. There was also a young woman from Hunan, Su Ping, who had all 3 required documents, her marriage certificate, her migrant worker permit and her temporary residence permit. Yet in 1999 she was forcibly detained by patrol police at Guangzhou railway station and sent to a mental institution where she was assaulted by several thugs. Tragic cases mounted. As public outcry surged, experts and public figures spoke out. On the 14th of May 2003, 3 law doctors petitioned the NPC Standing Committee as Chinese citizens. They called for a constitutional review of the measures for the custody and repatriation of urban vagrants and beggars. Listen carefully, everyone, a constitutional review. Their central argument was that these custody and repatriation measures restricted citizens' personal freedom. But then, these measures were merely administrative regulations issued by the State Council, not laws passed by the National People's Congress. According to the provisions of the Chinese Constitution and the legislation law, any compulsory measure that restricts personal freedom can only be established by law. Administrative regulations do not have this authority. Therefore, this system is fundamentally unconstitutional and illegal. A few days after this proposal was issued, 5 legal scholars from Peking University and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, once again in their capacity as citizens, submitted a petition to the National People's Congress recommending the initiation of a special investigation procedure into the Sun Zhigang case. Altogether, there were 8 scholars involved. They petitioned the National People's Congress with their request. A constitutional review? This had never happened before in Chinese history. In this way, a torrent of public opinion, carrying the immense anger of the people, surged towards Beijing. Ultimately, under enormous social pressure, things began to change. On 5 June 2003, the Guangzhou Intermediate People's Court held a trial for the Sun Zhigang case. 2 months later, the measures for the custody and repatriation of urban vagrants and beggars, which had been in force for 21 years, were officially abolished. The key change was the shift from compulsory detention to voluntary assistance. Subsequently, custody and repatriation centres across the country removed their signs one after another, and the temporary residence permit system was gradually replaced by the residence permit system. At least at the institutional level, no one could be forcibly detained simply for not carrying a temporary residence permit anymore. However, those who drove all these changes paid a heavy price. After Southern Metropolis Daily published its report, the Guangzhou Procuratorate, on charges of alleged embezzlement, sentenced the newspaper's general manager, Yu Hafeng, to 5 years in prison. Following that, the editor-in-chief, Chen Yizong, was also forcibly taken away in public and spent 5 months in jail. In the end, due to insufficient evidence, he was not prosecuted. One of the 3 law PhDs who participated in submitting the petition that year was later sentenced to 14 years in prison for promoting the citizens' rights movement on charges of subverting state power. Another is now living in exile overseas. At this point in the story, the unjust law was abolished, the murderer was sentenced, and the detention centres had their signs taken down. On the surface, it appears to be a story where justice ultimately prevails. But there is one extremely important question we have yet to discuss. How did all of this come about? Why did the detention system exist in the first place? Under CCP rule, a strict household registration system was introduced, categorising everyone as either urban or rural residents. City births granted an urban registration, providing access to urban education, healthcare, jobs and social security. Rural births meant you had a rural household registration, the household registration system, the temporary residence permit system, and the detention and repatriation system. These 3 were a carefully designed combination, together forming a systematic and institutionalised mechanism from the outset. They divided Chinese citizens into different classes and, under the guise of legality, allowed for the wanton persecution and exploitation of the lower classes. During the planned economy era, rural people were not allowed to enter the cities at will. To leave the village, you needed an introduction letter. So what happened if you entered the city without one? You would be considered a blind migrant, a member of the aimlessly floating population. The detention and repatriation system can be traced back as early as 1951. Initially, it targeted scattered nationalist soldiers and social vagrants. By the early 1960s, during the 3 years of Great Famine, large numbers of rural disaster victims flooded into the cities in search of survival due to hunger, and this system quickly shifted to forced repatriation, a disaster relief tool. By 1982, the State Council issued the measures for the detention and repatriation of urban vagrants and beggars. The name, as implied, targeted these groups, supposedly to provide relief, education and resettlement. To maintain social order and stability and promote unity, on the surface it all sounds very grand and dignified, as if the government is acting out of compassion to help vulnerable groups. But this is all just a pretty disguise. The real core purpose was never about relief from the very beginning. Instead, it maintains a beautiful urban order and stops rural to city migration. Professor Maha Wide of CUPL noted this system is urban biased, essentially acting as an urban protection tool in the rural-urban divide. It enacts different laws for farmers and urban residents, treating rural people as potential threats and as inferior, which fundamentally violates the most basic principle of equality in law. Crucially, by the early 90s, this system turned malignant. In 1991, State Council Document 48 broadened custody targets from beggars to 3 no individuals, those without papers, fixed housing or stable income. Later on, local governments kept tightening the rules, turning it into the 3 certificates, all of which were absolutely required. Even if you had all 3 certificates, you could still be picked up at any time and sent to a detention centre. Just think about it. This was no longer about so-called relief for vagrants, but blatant press-ganging of people off the streets. As things developed, the detention and repatriation system evolved into a complete chain of profit and exploitation, starting with fines and certificate fees. When the security teams caught people, they could fine them on the spot, 200, 300 yuan. If you paid up, they wouldn't detain you. Where did this money go? The permits were a business, costing 150 to 300 yuan and renewed annually. Most funds went to the local security system, plus favour fees for acquaintances. Once detained, families paid for releases via fees based on connections. The third layer was the detention centre's management fee. A 1998 case involving Hunan's Lianyuan City Centre showed detainees were split into categories A, B and C. Fees were tiered. Those held under 10 days paid 700 to 1,000 yuan. Over 10 days, the cost was 900 to 1,400 yuan. You have to understand that these people who were detained were not criminals at all. They simply hadn't obtained a temporary residence permit at the time. Yet, after being detained, they still had to pay out of their own pockets to the authorities as a management fee. Isn't that utterly absurd? The fourth layer is the profit from forced labour. The economic benefits generated by the detainees' work inside all go to the detention centre. Then the fifth layer is human trafficking. People are sold off for a per-head fee to other detention centres, brick kilns, mines, or even places further afield. This is blatant institutional crime, and what's more, it faces no accountability whatsoever. So in the end, this custody and repatriation system had fundamentally deviated from its supposed role as a tool for social management. It had become a money-making machine that operated by arresting and detaining people. From the local public security and security teams, joint defence teams, detention centres, to the civil affairs system, a network of mutual protection and profit sharing among officials was formed at every level. The more people they caught, the more money they made. So naturally, there were quotas for arrests. There were KPIs, and with the joint defence teams, they would even carry out surprise raids in the middle of the night. It got to the point where even if someone had a temporary residence permit in hand, they would tear it up before arresting them. Utterly absurd. In 2003, under immense public pressure following the Sun Zhigang case, the custody and repatriation system was finally abolished. But is China today really that different from back then? The name of the system may have been scrapped, but the rebranded methods of control have never disappeared. Black jails are still being used to intercept petitioners, to monitor and detain outspoken individuals, and those practices that arbitrarily restrict the personal freedom of Chinese citizens under various so-called pretexts, such as maintaining stability, security, or epidemic prevention, have not only failed to disappear, but have in fact become more covert, more widespread, and more routine. This is the most frightening aspect of this system. Not only does it create evil, it must also erase the memory of that evil. Not only does it never admit its mistakes, it also forces everyone to forget the countless crimes it has committed. But some things simply cannot be forgotten. Look at this. Somehow, this wooden plank has gone viral. Even people like me, who had no idea what a brick plank was, have now for the first time learned about the evil lurking behind the scenes. If you're like me, please do your friends a favour and give this video a like, or share today's episode with your family and friends. Every interaction from you helps us spread the truth even further. This chapter of history should not be forgotten. There is an inscription on Sun Zhigang's tombstone. I wish to bring kindness to the world, yet the common people are left to be preyed upon. Even today, these words remain deeply thought-provoking. Even today, China is still worth striving for. Alright then, let's leave it here for today. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoy my programme, don't forget to leave me a comment. Every interaction from you helps trigger YouTube's recommendation system, allowing my videos, especially content like this episode, to be seen by more Chinese people. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you again in our next episode on Thursday, right here on True Perspective. Don't miss it. Bye bye.